Okay, that's all. So we're all here, I think. So yeah, without further ado, under the motion, this House prefers a world with a strong emphasis on Jeong culture. I invite Prime Minister, you're here.
Okay, so I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So we as the government would like to propose to you a case today that includes or that entails strengthening the culture of Jeong. So first of all, what is the Jeong culture? Jeong culture is basically a set of values and principles that focuses on social cohesion and more support for the community. And it means basically to support your neighbors in everyday life. And it is a very integral part of Korean history from what I've understood from my teammates. So it is basically to be understood as like a collective form of parenting, right? So when parents, for example, are busy, Jeong culture entails that your neighbors or your friends or like grandparents will actively and self-evidently will contribute to caring for your child. And so it is kind of a form of parental love beyond the family that is geared towards the community. And so it entails basically to have an eye on the needs and struggles of others. And so the assumption here is that it kind of can take a whole town to raise a child. And so what would that look like to implement that more? We would instruct our kids to deliver more love to the ones around them and to have more social alert on existing problems, especially for the groups that are the most vulnerable in our society. So as a first thing that would happen if we would push the culture of Jeong, it means that you recognize struggles in society. This will then lead, because you recognize it and you see it, this will not only lead to more tolerance towards others, but you will also be more compassionate towards yourself because you actually realize, hold on, I might not be the only one struggling with this, and I can expect the support of others while I also support others. And so while society becomes more and more individualistic, we can see an erosion of Jeong culture, what has historically been there in Korean society for a long time, but it is currently destroyed by the individualistic and career-driven focus that societies take. And so it is hard to mobilize support for more collectively minded policies nowadays. Yuan?
So we're in the same debating community, and I'm currently struggling to win. If you support Jeong, why don't you perform a favor for me for losing this debate?
I think this is self-evident. Because I also struggle in this debate, and I also care about myself. So in establishing Jeong, as I said, we will have a struggle, we will have a focus more on vulnerable groups. And this is, in this debate for us, especially children, elderly people, and other political minorities. So, for children, in the current society that is being super individualistic and competitive, kids are very often being neglected. And the basic origins of Jeong culture were actually back in the days in more agriculture work, when there was no much time to actively care for your children because you were in the field all days. And so Jeong culture was actually an incentive for you to care for neighbors, to care for the other kids around, because only based on when you would care for other kids, then could you expect the others to care. So it was really like this altruistic giving and taking and creating a very more wholesome atmosphere for everyone. And so establishing Jeong culture on a more extensive level than we have it nowadays is actually an incentive to care for the kids in the community. Then, a very similar logic can actually be applied to elderly people. Because if we actively care for the struggles of elderly people in everyday life, we can actually make their lives a whole lot better. We've all taken the subway in Korea, and we all know the seats reserved particularly for the elderly people, for example. But how many times do you see still elderly people standing somewhere in the subway, not having a seat, nobody giving a shit, and still holding on to their own seat? So is this fair? No. Is this a system that actually works? So will you only make a seat for an elderly person just because a sign tells you to, or will you make a seat because they actually are more in need of a seat? So problems like these could be actually tremendously aided when we help elderly people. And because they are older, they're probably more familiar with the Jeong system in the first place. So we can also actually expect them to give more back. And so finally, I will also argue that this kind of Jeong culture will also lead to a more holistic and more proper welfare state. Because I'm actually going to prove to you that when we implement this on a individual community-based level, that we can actually facilitate a tangible change. So, what is a welfare state? A welfare state is basically a solidarity-based form of statecraft that will care and provide for its citizens to a certain extent. And so while there are very many different models out there, there are also very many countries in the world at the moment that do not provide anything. Even the richest countries in the world, like look at the social systems of the US, for example, it basically gives you nothing. But so when we have Jeong values more established in our societies, we have a grassroots interest in a welfare state because we already care for our fellow human beings. We already take care and we already have an active eye out. So this, for example, might include taking better care of kindergartens, because as I said, like, kids are the most vulnerable. They are basically half-made human beings. They are in need of the protection from adults. So taking care of kindergartens is pivotal for the health of a society. Same goes for schools, and then also, as I said, same goes for elderly care, same goes for the health system, because we're all in need of a doctor every now and then. So the list goes really on and on. So due to the intrinsic interest that comes from Jeong, we can actually facilitate an environment and we can facilitate a state that from a systemic level cares more for the well-being of its citizens. And so this is actually also the very base of democracy, right? Like giving your vote in the belief that this is best that this is the best for the country. And so and this can also then, in the end of the day, be a way of being more resilient against the current wave of right-wing policies and populism that we experience all over the world. Because let's face it, that is the kind of political orientation that is mainly based on hatred and of disregarding others and excluding others. And so, to conclude, by introducing Jeong and pushing a very selfless, altruistic form of actively caring for each other, we will counter the individualistic drive that we currently experience that is arguably very harmful to community cohesion. And so for me, OP really has to prove to us why an individualistic society is so much better and where else incentives to help others would come from. Proud to propose. Thank you.
Which will start in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to be starting with an anecdote. Imagine there's a world where there's a lion and a sheep and they live together. One day, the sheep constantly gives grass to the lion, being like, I love you, I want to have Jeong with you, and so I want to keep giving this grass because this is something that I love the most. You know, lion says, thank you all the time and receives this, and eventually the lion gets kind of fed up with what the sheep gives grass and asks, actually, I don't really eat grass, I eat meat, all right? At the point in which the lion was able to voice out their demands and say that I want meat, she was able to understand the fact that, the lion doesn't eat grass, but rather meat, and thereby they were able to live a better life. In the world, given that this theme is life, I think the burden that both houses have in today's debate is who is able to have better life, not on just an individual level, but on a societal level. We tell you that in a world of Jeong, where emotional connection with different people are often forced upon each other, that this leads to less agency or the ability to demand from individuals. At the point you have, not emphasis on Jeong, but more emphasis on people you get to choose to be with, and you get to voice out your certain demands as opposed to constantly forcing emotional connection. We're able to see better, more happier people in an individualistic and a societal level. We think that the kind of world in which the welfare state that the government world is trying to prove, a world where we have people who are living more fairly and kindly to each other is not actually premised upon the need of Jeong. We don't need Jeong to have such a kind society. We got alternative forces like kindness, morality, and empathy still exist on our side. So let me first talk about what kind of counterfactual we're defending. First of all, we tell you that the kind of people you want to share emotional connection with or have shared experiences is something that you get to specifically selectively choose, right? You get to choose with these people. Maybe the standards of this metric might be the fact that you trust this person as opposed to the fact that you just live in the same location and therefore you're expected to give Jeong to them. Maybe it's the fact that you just like that person, you like certain qualities, or you feel comfortable around those people. Secondly, we don't think that Jeong is a necessary precondition in order to have things like kindness. We think that people, can still be nice to each other on the our side, because the general incentive for people to be good people, because I want to feel good and I want to adopt the identity that I am a good person, still exists on our side. But also thirdly, we think that in extreme circumstances when communities need to help each other, I think that basic level of empathy and morality exists. For example, if my dad died, yesterday, and I have to come to KNC and I plead someone to speak against me in this position, I'm pretty sure that there will be friends and communities around who is not reliant on Jeong, but based on understanding of my circumstances are able to willing to step into this position. On their side, let's paint a world of their side. We think the government world looks like where shared emotional connection and ties are expected of people because you live in the same community, right? We think that this largely looks like, for example, you're forced to share detailed information about yourself to other people even if you don't want to, because you live in the same community. So you're not just you don't have the agency to specifically tell this to one person, but you're expected to tell it to all individuals who live in this community. Secondly, when it comes to financial obligation, instead of you're kind of giving this lending money out of Jeong, as opposed to specifically negotiating terms and demands and interest rates, etc., or when you have to pay it back, or I can only give you this much, etc., etc. Those kinds of negotiating power exists less on their extent. But also thirdly, when we talk about things like communal responsibility, it is something that is expected of you, and therefore you should do it out of goodwill. On the comparative, where on our side, we have the ability to negotiate what kind of communal responsibility is directed at what kind of people, and you also get to refuse it if you don't want to. With that said, I have two arguments. Firstly, why this concept of Jeong community is bad. This is because the community in which you are subject to give Jeong to is often determined very arbitrarily, largely by, for example, geographical location, maybe class or religion. The people that you're expected to give Jeong to are not something that you chose to give to, but rather people who you likely choose to live in the same circumstance, same geography and community. Meaning that, the people who you're expected to share these communal values with is not something that has born out of your choice. But also secondly, this idea of Jeong increases the burden in which you have to help these people when you're not necessarily compensated back. Meaning that you especially have to give time and effort into helping out these people when you don't necessarily get anything back, and that is something that you're expected to kind of uphold. This is especially demanded more because you're in this community, in this world, you're raised that way to have Jeong, but also secondly, because everyone else also engages in the same Jeong activity, and so you're collectively coerced to do so as well. With that, in the comparative, when we get to selectively apply and choose the people that we're able to engage with, you selectively choose who you ask or share these information with, which gives you far more agency to be able to live in a world that is according to your standards. But also thirdly, when we talk about things like money lending and communal responsibility, you have more clear metrics that you're able to negotiate. This leads to the reason why this is really important is because the reason why Jeong community is secondarily bad is because it leads to an eradication of individualism. So at the point in which you're living in this Jeong community and you have very, very different standards, for example, I don't have conservative ideals in a very conservative society, or I just hold different ideologies, it is emotional connection, shared experience is something that is expected of you, so you're less likely to voice out things that are different from others, because then you'll be named and shamed as something that is not having Jeong. Because in a world where Jeong is strongly emphasized, at the point in which you don't have Jeong or you tend to stray away from differences, you also get the narrative and you're susceptible to the narrative that you don't have Jeong. The reason why this is especially bad is because it specifically hurts because the idea of Jeong is disproportionately applied to most vulnerable people. Because if you look at society, even in the world where they have Jeong, differences in, for example, things like gender politics, the fact that men have more power than women, things like ethnic differences, class differences still exist. The reason why this is important is because people who are of elite and of higher power have greater ability to opt out of narratives of Jeong, whereas people who are low, usually women, are expected more to give this kind of this kind of Jeong back. This is because the kind of microaggression abuse of if you don't do this, you don't have Jeong is applied more to people of lower people, whereas higher people are able to, even if they face that backlash, they can still get community elsewhere. They have the ability to use their money that they have to move to a different location, etc., etc. So they have greater ability to opt out. The nuance that I'm trying to gain is things like, these people at the bottom, their ability to, for example, regain their rights, for example, for women's rights to improve, for things like labor unions to happen, is contingent on the idea of voicing different demands and thereby sometimes breaching the idea of Jeong or communal, the idea of having shared experiences in, I guess, talking about different experiences or not giving that emotional connection and severing those ties. With that, the kind of nuance that we're trying to say is that these people of lower demographics are able to get more agency on the R side. Finally, the reason why this is so harmful, this Jeong culture is so harmful, is because necessarily you don't have an ability to opt out, because at the point in which, there's a coerciveness and shame culture that is surrounded around it, you significantly have less leverage to opt out of these scenarios. For those reasons, we create a better society where individuals are able to better demand their rights in the world where we don't have Jeong. Very proud to propose.
Let me begin my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The counter-narrative that the opposition today is giving us, that you're going to selectively choose people who you want to give love to, I think this is exactly the same as the status quo, right? I think if they want to actually defend the status quo to the full level of extent, they have to see the reality, when actually parents are actually teaching their kids to not help people choking on the road because they might sue you later when they're not alive, right? We see the extreme cases of individualism happening. They can't just selectively say that, oh, people will help out their friends anyway, because we see these vulnerable people being neglected from society, and this kind of benefits is never a thing that is coming up from the opposition's world. They say that, oh, people can voice out their demands, good, but when the demands are never actually fulfilled in their world, I think it's much better for our world to actually have people to actually help you around, even if it's the minimal demand, as kind of like a washed down demands that you're in it compared to your initial demand. And firstly, they say that, oh, Jeong is really arbitrary, that you can't choose who you want to. Jeong is really arbitrary, applied upon religious factors or family factors or communal factors. I firstly deny that from that premise from get-go. I think that you guys all have went at least once to travel to Korea's traditional markets. There are a whole bunch of ajummas just giving out you free food just because they want your love and they actually care for others and actually are so happy to see foreigners or maybe your young faces. I think that Jeong is based on more altruistic aspects rather than you having connection with your religion or maybe your commonalities. And when Clara is saying that, oh, I can make friends with my some commonalities, I can make a lot of friends with this debate and actually find the debate substitutes, that's the exact thing that's happening. Is that's the exact thing that we think that we're focusing on Jeong culture as well, because now you see that individual that's struggling as same individual as your human being, and therefore even if despite you have certain kind of differences, because you emphasize the fact that in the first place you're a human being that has certain kind of commonalities, you actually highlight the commonalities much more in an extent that you actually feel the incentive to actually help these people out, even if you find kind of differences in different fields existing. And this is when Jeong culture actually puts into our society. I think our prime minister gives you enough explanation about how the background culture of Jeong is actually working in South Korea. The Jeong culture, if you see the real stem of it, it's deeply agricultural background. We say that when everyone was struggling with lack of hands to actually mow your grass field or something, you were asking people around, the neighbors around, to actually help you because you have to actually produce things in the right excess and you want to harvest and fall, right? That communal support was needed in the first place to actually get help out. And here, the reason, and therefore the stem of Jeong culture was when everyone was out of work and your kids were just neglecting, starving in your desk, when your parents were not there to actually cook you dinner. It was Jeong culture that actually forced your ajumma neighborhoods to actually ask and see if neighborhood kids are starving or not, and that incentive is in the first place really helpful in our society and altruistic, and that's the benefit that we are gaining when they actually give us no incentive for individuals to actually relate in any kind with vulnerable people within our state. And here we think that this traditional Jeong culture actually eroded because after World War, when everyone was so just busy in bulge of survival or whatnot. But I think that compared to that, in our status quo, we have much more surplus in our society that we can share with others. If you see the reality, we see the Confucianist culture of Korea getting highlighted a lot, that, oh, we think that we're having respect to elderly people and having that values and having reviving the traditional values are such a good thing, and currently, and that's the exact reason why this Jeong culture debate is even happening, because people find that it's surprisingly good thing that exists in the past, but why not now? Then that's the exact reason I think that we want to teach our kids to actually care for others and look for others out, not actually ignoring people suffering on the road because they're a total stranger. And that's the change we're proposing, more than proud to propose. What you give us a substantive. Firstly, we tell you that this becomes a basis of altruism. You don't cherry pick individuals that you want to help. This is a basis of altruism that you teach, that even if you have differences, you are be able to help your friends out. And secondly, we tell you that it gives more incentive to care about minorities. Firstly, you at least can recognize the struggles. When they're only focusing on the commonalities, it's really low possibility for you to actually relate to others. Compared to that, because you see them as a same individual human being, there's more incentive for them actually be understandable. If you really see the reality in Joseon Nangjoshilok, I don't think you guys know it, it's a history book in South Korea, when we really have records that in the past, when the concept of disabled people didn't even exist, there was more disabled people less discriminated in the society because they just saw each other as equal human beings with some kind of differences. We see the society when we actually realize having disabled people as simply a different trait, having different hair colors or whatnot. We want that to happen, and we want to normalize those kind of differences that exist in our society, and that is what we are proposing. And here, secondly, we give a little mechanism about how this actually enhances the tolerance, seeing differences among you. We see a lot of no kids zone actually arising in our society, a lot of people being discriminated and actually being excluded to actually have access to this kind of social resources. What we are proposing you is that this genuine affection actually leads to these people having more tolerance towards seeing others. Therefore, you will have more elderly people being able to be on social transport. We'll have more visible vulnerable people, and that's in the first place impact that we can have. And thirdly, how we're going to actually achieve that societal change at the legislative level. Just because you have a minority doesn't directly mean that it'll lead to legislations to help these minorities, right? For this kind of things to have, you need to happen.
So in the culture of Jeong culture, you also have a lot of microaggression that is perpetuated on the notion of Jeong. So you're expected to give.
I think that is totally okay if it's to the level extent that you're coerced to actually help your neighbors out. Because just simply that you're forced to do something doesn't directly mean that you're bad, right? You're forced to wear a seatbelt or whatnot. When this kind of coercion is actually leading to a better productive, better helpful society and loving society, we think that it's okay to push people to do so. And secondly, because we're teaching kids from really young age that it's good to help others. Firstly, I don't think that microaggression will feel that hard, because people will actually feel oblique to do so, because they won't question the narrative that, oh, do I have to help others? It's more like your natural instinct that you actually be educated from your parents that you have to help others. So I don't think that it's the burden that's imposed to the individuals is actually existing in the first place. Moving on to our substances. It is our world when vulnerable people who doesn't even have friends or commonalities will have the critical mass and allies to actually help you, because your bond is more based on more altruistic values. You don't have to find similarities with other minorities or vulnerable people to actually help you out. That is how we're going to achieve societal change in the long-term impact we're proud to propose.
Roses are red, violets are blue, Jeong my ass, this world is bad. The first thing I want to do is in terms of talk about the comparative. I.e., government's main claim is the fact that you want to necessarily improve social cohesion and moral community, but I would argue they never actually explain to us what this community likely looks like. I think there are actually three important parts of comparative. The first thing is that in opposition, obviously probably communities still likely exist. The difference is that probably in terms of communities, there are no things like social expectations. It's likely that things like responsibilities and mandations don't necessarily exist. And I would argue, for instance, this probably looks like in the instances that you're probably talking to your neighbors, for instance, that you obviously have to talk about things like financial quid pro quos in terms of salary that you're necessarily getting. Secondly though, obviously on our side, it's significantly better for individuals to self-select in terms of the kind of emotional talks they're talking about. I.e., for instance, even when you're talking about the same friend group, I can selectively use when I'm comfortable with specific individuals over others. I.e., when I'm still in the same friend group of YU, for instance, I could talk to someone uniquely about how Milan's hickeys really disturb me, but also I could just uniquely talk to other people about how one day's girlfriend unfortunately is going to lose in this debate. But thirdly, even in the most extreme instances in this debate, I would argue to you, obviously people have a moral standard to be nice. I.e., if someone is dying on the street, there are things like Good Samaritan laws. There are literally good instances that people can do in terms of literally phoning the police. That's the minimum people have to do, because this is just outside of the kind of moral and cultural context. This is just a universally good thing. There are two important clashes in this debate. First is that these strong communities in and of itself is bad for the people in it, and secondly that there's importance of applicated individualism on our side. The first thing we claim as opposition is that these communities with these obligatory practices and these like toxic expectations are bad. The first thing we told you is that often these communities tend to have very, very massive coercive pressures, i.e. insofar as there are specific virtues of these communal responsibilities, there are people that entrench the system of communal responsibilities, critically meaning that regardless of the community you're opting into, there's presumably some degree of power asymmetry between the medium and necessarily the people that control what the communal responsibilities are. So for instance, if you're in necessarily like something like African tribe, obviously the lord, the like tribe lord necessarily can tell the medium populace it is a communal responsibility to buy these people food. Priests, for instance, can necessarily tell the medium populace it is a moral duty for these people to necessarily pay money. So secondly, though, this is really, really bad because often when the interest of the average populace tends to contradict the institutes of communal responsibilities, it's really, really hard for you to opt out. And that's why my POI really mattered earlier, because obviously at the point in which they also don't necessarily want to lose this debate, you obviously have to make specific concessions, and if they clear, for instance, this world is really patriarchate, on their side, when there's a long, strong like culture of Jeong, obviously their side will be the one that loses out, because often minorities do not have the necessary checks and balances to go over this. But secondly, let's assume even at their best, there's no kind of power asymmetry. Here are two structural reasons why this is bad. Firstly is because often individuals have massive physical and mental burden to like fulfill all the kind of expectations placed on them. Obviously, when you look at the example, for instance, like elderly people on the streets, obviously you might have some simple reason that you're really, really tired. Maybe your family member just died. But because of all these kind of arbitrary communal responsibilities that says that because someone is just like old, you have to necessarily cater to them more, means that your preferences are sub-prioritized. And I would argue to you that people and individuals should be able to decide when their agency matters over other people. But thirdly, is that it's really hard for these communities to be opt-outable. That's what government never explains to you. Because I would argue to you, at the point in which you already fulfill one communal responsibility, one obligation, the kind of narrative that sticks to you is, you already did this for me once, you have to do it for me again. So obviously those toxic precedents make it really, really hard for you to opt out, and this is really bad. Therefore, their case is innately flawed, and they never actually properly mechanize what these communities look like. There are three comparatives. The first is, at least on our side, you have significantly better checks and balances systems, i.e. at the point in which there are no arbitrary expectations from you, you get much more concrete standards in terms of what is good. So for instance, when you're necessarily going to be homesteading your neighbor's child or necessarily changing their grandpa's diapers, I don't know, like obviously you know necessarily what you're able to get in return because there are specific obligations necessarily placed, so you don't necessarily get influenced as much in terms of arbitrariness. Secondly, I would also agree with government in terms of some degree of institutional abuse happening in terms of power asymmetry in communities. The difference is, at least on our side, things like domestic microaggressions likely decrease because it's significantly easier for general populaces to count out specific virtues that they don't necessarily agree with, because there's no toxic standard that you have to conform to what the majority belief is. Critically meaning that often when there's like some kind of problem in terms of community expectations, obviously people can point that out, so the kind of like problems and the consequences of these power asymmetry likely decreases. But thirdly, it's just easier to opt out. For instance, when you're a toxic friend group and you don't necessarily expect it to do for a thing anywhere, at least on our side, at the point in which you're still able to prioritize individualism and there's no moral expectation to do everything, it's just so much easier because everyone around you is saying, oh, you could just leave your toxic friend group. So the people that are on your side and allies significantly likely increase as well. That's the unique comparative. I know this is a soft debate, that these are important impacts. The second thing I want to talk about is in terms of importance of applicated individualism, which government never engages with. The first thing we told you is that often there are many social coercive pressures from Jeong that necessarily forces people to come out, i.e. that at the point in which you might necessarily not agree with the conservative values of your conservative parents, at the point in which you might necessarily be a sexual minority, at the point in which there's huge amounts of toxic pressures that tells you, you have to come out to us, you have to tell us all your emotional thoughts, it makes it significantly harder for you to not hide it, because obviously all your other friends are saying, oh, you should just tell your parents, or necessarily all the kind of media that you're exposed to necessarily say you have to do this even if you don't want to. And even if it's not these extreme instances of identity, if it's like a very personalized story of trauma, for instance, or very sad like emotional stories, obviously it's significantly better on our side at the point in which you selectively choose who to tell to, apart from a blanket narrative of community where some people in your community you might not necessarily be as close to, and you don't necessarily want to tell all these strangers your personal stories. That's really, really bad. But secondly, this also pushes people to conform, i.e. at the point in which there's a lack of individualism and everyone is like adhering to these communal expectations, you yourself feel like you have to adhere to these expectations too. Critically meaning, it's unlikely to get the change the Deputy Prime Minister talks about in things like legislation, insofar as things like minorities have systematic harder issues accessing these kind of venues, and like so much more problem in terms of like talking and making sure these kind of amendments to policies are much better, like worse. What is the comparative then? Firstly, they still never engage with their biggest impact, which is at least we have selective individualism. You're able to come out to your friends who you feel like comfortable with, or people outside your community in applicated purposes where you necessarily want to be like talk about your kind of like emotional trauma related to some like sexual assault incident, and that necessarily gives you much more comfort because you knew that it was your volition, autonomy to necessarily come out. But secondly, you just get much more things like diverse ideas. So on balance, I would argue this is good. But thirdly, even in terms of things like, oh, but like when you go to like a market in Korea and these like old women give you things for free, I would argue to you as someone like probably that goes to a very prestigious university like them, probably they have much more capital to apply. So I think it's just good that you actually give financial compensation to all these nice people, right? I don't necessarily understand why it should be a social expectation for all these people living in these markets to necessarily give you free food. I think that's just very toxic things that necessarily entrenches things like financial inequality. The last thing I just want to talk about those things, grassroots movements and welfare states. I don't think you get grassroots movements when there's already collective consensus to agree to some kind of norm. It's only on our side when individuals say, my individual belief matters, and therefore I want to start these grassroots movements, is when you only get the benefits. So happy to oppose.
Thank you for the speech. I now invite government people.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to do 3 things in my speech. First of all, I want to give you a very clear and accurate, much more accurate characterization toward Jeong, what Jeong is. And second of all, I want to discuss about the vulnerable ones, who is the pretty big stakeholders in this debate. Third of all, I want to go on to the argument regarding legislation and how we're going to actually we are more likely to actually benefit everyone in the society, even outside the community at the end of the day. So first of all, let me start with the characterization toward Jeong. So I think the opposition in today's debate, a lot of arguments that a lot of misunderstanding that comes out from the opposition side debate kind of is based on the mischaracterization of Jeong, what a Jeong is. So we reject opposition come up to the podium and just says that Jeong is like something Jeong is a very strong restriction that you can actually voluntarily decide like whether you're going to opt in or opt out. Rather, we believe that Jeong is kind of a like soft system, the atmosphere itself that existing in the community that actually make more individuals to actually voluntarily go for the constructive form of help and more have a self-efficacy or feel more happiness by helping each other and by feeling the altruism for the others. We believe that what Jeong is. So firstly, because of this, we reject the argument coming up from the opposition about the very strong burden and they're enforcing people to opt into the help, and this is going to be harmful to the individual. So, and secondly, I want to mention I want to emphasize the characterization of Jeong again, that it is not an act of a trade-off that like only when you give me the interest, then I'll give interest to you back. So we believe that is not the how the system of Jeong works. We believe that you can several times opt out, opt out in the collective form of parenting or nursing because you don't have time or you don't have the capacity. But we believe that doesn't mean that community will just suddenly just block you and suddenly exclude you from the community. We believe that the community who has the atmosphere of Jeong or the system of Jeong is actually very inclusive to those people and to those people and just don't suddenly block them or exclude them out of the society. Why is this? Because from the first speaker of our side continuously mentioned that the context of Jeong itself was derived from the in agricultural society, the concept of the joint parenting or nursing. We believe that every individual is treated as the person who can later give the help to the other people, or later maybe the people who can give the help to the others maybe later. So we believe that is the incentive for people to include even those kind of people. Yeah. However, in the long run, we believe that there will be more individuals to opt into these kind of collective form of help or the system that Jeong makes, because we believe that in the community with the atmosphere of Jeong, individual would be more exposure to the bloom of the community that is made by the system of Jeong, right? We believe that compared to the when we compare the model, that there is 옆집 아줌마, the 아줌마 that lives you in your neighbor who can help you, parenting when you're in work or whatnot. And the opposition model that there is a mom alone and don't have any hand of help. We believe that the individual would actually feel that, oh, this is have some extent of benefit, and this is the actually good thing that I want to voluntarily opt in. Maybe later. Yeah. Yeah, and also secondly, I want to clearly characterize what sector Jeong involves in. So I think we were kind of pretty clear on this point when our first speaker said that the very context of the Jeong from the very get-go. We believe that what sector system of Jeong involves in, mainly caring and nursing and having the very voluntary help to the other and having affection and caring, having more interest on others. We believe that this is not the sector that some people want and some people don't want. We believe that this kind of sector is mandatory for all the people, and especially the caring and nursing. We believe that this is what people normally systemically lack in today in these kind of modern society. We believe that we believe that this is what people is actually needed at the end of the day. And moving on to the next point of my speech about, let me discuss about the vulnerable ones. So they came up to the podium and said that what if the the poor or the vulnerable who don't have the capacity to provide the help to the others. We believe that that vulnerable status of that individual self is very symmetric on both sides. However, what we give to that, what change give to that individual is that one could be the receiver of the help from the system of Jeong. We believe that poor people or mom, the alone mom will actually receive the help from their ajummas or ajoshis living their neighbor. We believe that in that case, since when they do not actually change anything, but we have those marginal changes, they will be receiving the point. And also the Jeong community will actually not requires a lot, because they also understand, humanely understand their status, and they cannot actually give money or whatnot. And the counter narrative, the counterfactual that they provided about how they're going to help these poor people is about
The problem is that on your side, you're reliant on your neighbor constantly caring for your child, which might pressure this neighbor, but on our counterfactual, you actually get, maybe get childcare where you actually have negotiated hours and pay, which is more consistent. And
I think I pretty much explained that how Jeong is not the very strong constraint that goes to individuals. So I'll just continue. So their counterfactual was that they're going to do this on individual level. These kind of help is also can be provided by their friends or whatnot. However, that is symmetric on both sides. But we are having more help, and we are more having systemic help, which is consisted of that community and the system of that community. And lastly let me move on to the legislation part. So we talked about how these going to go for So let me compare the model. So there are several reasons why they cannot actually make the legislation or the very national structure to give a welfare or caring about their welfare, because the people often think that building a welfare is a trade-off. So they think that building a welfare system is having loss on their own interest. We believe that these kind of mindset itself can be changed by the system of Jeong. So we believe that this is more likely to happen in our side of the world at the end of the day, which actually benefits everyone, even outside of the community. And therefore, I'm very proud to
Thank you for the speech. And now we invite opposition whip.
I think this debate was over after DLO, but I'll do my best to just widen the margins a bit. I think I'm going to give you just like an interesting fact. South Korea has the proud record of having the longest unbroken chain of history, of slavery, sorry. I would say that is a definite structure which was probably maintained by Jeong in South Korea because all of these people were equal and they relied on each other to stay alive and support each other for things like raising their children, which is their main characterization, for example. Likely, it was maintained for so long because they were unable to break out of those chains because they were expected to do so, and it was just like something that was seen as socially acceptable and socially like seen as something that should just be maintained, right? Probably that is something that is bad, and that's something that we tell you from from our LO is something that we're better able to like break out of, given the fact that there's still a high level of injustice within the status quo that we probably change to a larger extent. I think the issues here are just going to be like, what are the harms and what are the benefits? How do we improve society to a better extent? First, on harms, I think the first thing we tell you is that people still feel emotional connections on our side of the house. It's just the fact that we're able to be much more selective, both in how you choose relations, but also nuanced in how you engage with other people, right? But you are also likely to still have a community anyways, things like friends and family, and uniquely on our side, it's how you engage with them that you are able to choose, whereas on their side, communication is open, and that's not a possibility. Obviously, we already proved to you what the harms are, those harms are probably bad. Their side is arbitrarily controlled, on the other hand, where, for example, where you're born, who you're born to, and what your social status is, and likely the expectations of you are different based on these different scenarios, likely meaning that your community is preset for you, and you don't have the option to choose what community you want to belong to or what friends you want to have, given that it's likely going to be the people that are closest to you, like your parents' friends, for example, and therefore you're unable to choose individually how you want to live your life, right? But the problem with this is that it's likely to be coercive to some extent because a hierarchy still exists in terms of where you're born, right? But even if this isn't true, there's still an expectation asymmetry, right? Given that an offer of help isn't always wanted, but the type of help is also bad. Even if I actively want to help an injured person on the street who broke their leg, I would just make it worse, for example, because I'm not a doctor, and so on our side of the house, the rational thing to do is send them to a doctor. But this culture incentivizes this person to not speak up, and it incentivizes me to help them, therefore just making the situation worse. I can probably think of 10 other situations in which this probably also happened as well. Obviously, they tell you, as a response to Sena's POI, that obviously you should also care about yourself. But the problem with this is that on their side of the house, you have the expectation to help others before you help yourself. But this doesn't necessarily prove that people are actually going to be better actors on their side of the house. It's just the fact that they're expected to help these people because there's collective pressure to do this. For example, if you don't take care of my child, my community is going to shun you because you're not adhering to these principles that exist within them. Probably that's uniquely bad. But if we just co-opt their characterization about raising children being the main goal of Jeong from from the first place, notice this also is far worse for women, since patriarchal norms still exist in the status quo that raising children should be done by women, which is all the more true based on the timeline where Jeong was created, for example, right? Contemporarily, there's still two issues with this. First is that the people in positions of power are still often men, meaning there's a direct mechanism to how this entrenchment of roles is enforced on their side of the house, which is my first point on why injustices probably still exist in the status quo and why their side is probably worse. Whereas on our side, it's just systematized, meaning the burden is taken by people who actually want to raise children. I don't think they ever engage with how they outweigh these types of systems where we can just hire a babysitter to take care of of your child for you, for example, which is probably far more effective, right?
Yeah. Confirming to the public trend or maybe following things trending on viral, it happens on your world as well because you want to make more friends. Why is microaggression exclusive on our side?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
You'll have to follow the trend or maybe follow things that your friends do in your world as well. Why is microaggression only applied on our world?
Okay, that's just a mitigation, right? Considering that we still have self-agency. If I want to follow a trend, I can also choose not to do it on my side of the house. Whereas on your side, the backlash that comes from going against this trend is far greater, right? That's just very weak mitigation. But what we tell you then is that this naturally leads to the end of individualism as well, which is uniquely bad for vulnerable groups, because the unique nuance here is that you're unable to be selective in how or when or to whom you divest your information that is uniquely vulnerable to you, for example, which is likely to lead to very uncomfortable situations for these people. And the weighing here is that on their side, there's no mechanism to opt out on their side of the house, because there's a lot of social obligations placed on you. And even if I'm charitable, it's still an expectation which likely leads to some form of social backlash, even if it's not public or expressly said to you. It's still an expectation that's likely to lead to some level of social backlash, whereas on our side it's just far less, right? Second, on benefits on our side of the house, what we tell you is that just generally we create less arbitrary systems for doing things like favors, given that you do things like pay for them, for example, which is just a far better way of doing this because we systematize things, right? So if you want something, you can actually have a system that does it for you but reliably as well, right? And notice you do this without needing to impede on others' lives because you're actually paying for their services and they're consenting to doing it from the get-go. which is also why it's like a direct response to them saying that people are too individualistic and don't care about others on our side of the house, because that's simply not true. It's just the fact that these things are systematized, so we don't need to necessarily think about these things. But I'd also argue to you that just in social settings, like, obviously there's a large mitigation because it's not always true. Like, people still have empathy, right? People do get up on the subway sometimes, maybe it's not all the time, but the government still provides things like homeless shelters, for example. In some instances, they provide subsidized healthcare if you're very old and you're very frail. There's also like international aid provided to countries that are comparatively poor. There's still a million instances of like where people and countries are just generally still have empathy, which is not just generally mutually exclusive to their side. They can't just claim that they're the only side that has empathy and produces good people. I'd instead argue to you that the good actions that are created by them are placed upon them due to collective pressure rather than them actually wanting to do these things. What we tell you is that this is good because it creates comparatively less exploitative systems. Like we already tell you with things like women's rights, for example, because you're able to voice different opinions without being immediately shunned or ostracized. And that only happens in the point in time in which this risk doesn't play out, because obviously a minority, being the minority, is actively disincentivized from pursuing things like differing opinions at the point where they're like where there's like an expectation of backlash against them. So ultimately, we have the ability for systematic change, which benefits the oppressed, and at the point where inequality still exists, the Jeong culture is highly likely to be suboptimal and also doesn't necessarily produce people that are just good, but rather pressured into doing good things, which isn't necessarily the same thing. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
Thank you for the speech. I now invite opposition reply.
Chef, global poor all around the world, and no matter which country in which they live, will have to live in a system of Jeong. Our case as opposition is ridiculously simple. Jeong is wrong, wrong is Jeong. There are three important clashes in this debate. The first is why governments are enshackled with injustices. There are a couple of things that were important in this debate. The first thing we told you is the government failed to fulfill their burden at the point in which they don't explain why individuals should still fulfill certain social expectations or certain obligations, but they simply do not have the capacity to do so. So for instance, if I literally shot myself in the foot like government did with this debate, why do I necessarily have to give up a seat on the train for an elderly person who might arbitrarily just be 50 years older than me? But secondly, maybe I'm just a whiny bitch, right? Maybe the problem still though is the fact that they still don't assess the kind of power imbalances that still stem from these kind of communities. The fact that a lot of arbitrary virtues are necessarily stem from people in positions of power, things like war tribes or like tribe lords or things like priests necessarily have much more control over the kind of social expectations that are imposed. Critically meaning you don't necessarily might have to like not agree with the kind of community standards you live in. Our comparative was twofold. The first thing we told you is at least on our side you dictate what the quid pro quo is. At least, for instance, when you have to homestead a child, or necessarily when you're relying on the ajuma over there, you know the fact that how much ajuma is necessarily going to cost. So obviously there are much more proper labor conditions, for instance, or better financial exchange systems better in place. But secondly, sure, obviously our side is not necessarily saying we're able to completely eradicate this whole act of abuse, but what we're simply saying is things like, for instance, domestic cultural narratives, where men just say it should be just a favor that women are staying at home and necessarily be a homesteader, for instance. Those kind of toxic narratives are likely to be less entrenched on our side at the point in which there are no social expectations that have been perpetuated by these kind of groups of power. For those reasons, they already lose in terms of necessarily proving their burden of why these communities tend to have a good characterization. The second thing I want to talk about is why on the proposition side they're confined by the lack of alternatives. There's a couple of things here. The first is because it's very hard for people to opt out of these communities for a couple of reasons. The first thing is Diallo already told you the fact of toxic precedents. The fact that once you donate to church and once you necessarily do specific favors, it just becomes so much easier for people to control their narrative and telling you, oh, you already did this once, you should do it again. But secondly, it's just so much easier at the point in which Milan tells you, for instance, the fact that everyone else is doing it. So it's really hard for you to uniquely be the only one to do so, because obviously everyone uses this virtue as like a carrot to say, if you don't do this, we're going to kick you out. So obviously there's so much more coercive pressure for these people living in these communities. But the second thing is this is really bad, because obviously you have to succumb to the collective consensus of what it is. Obviously, as a single individual, at the point in which there's a lack of individualism and there's too much focus on things like this collective action, I would just argue it just means that people think virtues are a given. I would argue these are really, really toxic at the point in which people might not necessarily agree with certain virtues, but because of the kind of arbitrary reasons that they were just born into that kind of community, or because their parents necessarily were just religious and necessarily had to succumb to it, people don't necessarily get that. The comparative, at least on our side was extremely simple, because at least on our side, people can opt in because people and all the kind of narratives surrounding things like individualism or the kind of communities is that nothing is expected of you. You should just leave that kind of toxic friend group because they're doing nothing, like they're literally not getting you anything, regardless of whether it's like financial fulfillment or things like emotional fulfillment. So it's significantly easier in terms of the individual rationale to move out of all these toxic communities. So we actually have the solvency here as well. The third issue was why individualism is better than a Marxist revolution. The first thing we told you is because obviously things like individualism, at the point in which you focus on things like LGBTQ rights, or when you have specific, very personalized emotional trauma stories that you don't necessarily want to share with your communities, you can much better selectively apply it instead of having this blanket narrative that suggests to us now we have to share all these kind of like all these strangers in a specific community and like show the fact that you like necessarily agree to those values. So obviously you have much more nuanced individual approaches to specific issues. You get much more nuanced things like grassroots movements because no one's telling you you have to already adhere to whatever the majority narrative is. It's ironic that SNU school motto is the truth brings the light, but the only thing I see is darkness. Very happy with this.
The opposition side in today's debate is basically saying that, oh, people will at least have decent level of human morality in their world, and they will have decent level of care among their neighbors in their world. And having such a soft stance, then how are you different from this Jeong actually pushing people to helping others, right? They have to defend individualism and status quo to the full extent when we're seeing kids actually starving at home, like 911 getting sued for having a scar within the skin, or maybe vulnerable people only having to beg for an earning because it's extremely individualistic society. Because people are greedy, they don't even share the surplus that they have. They have to defend the status quo to the full extent. The mechanism only that's given from the opposition side today is that, oh, make enough friends and make connections and actually pay for the reward. That is so naive thing to say. Maybe because they're college students, they have a lot of friends, but as we characterize you, the vulnerable people in this extremely competitive society are the working moms and dads who don't even have time to meet their friends, or maybe you really have less allies because you're a minority, and those are the vulnerable people here, not only people who having a whole bunch of friends to actually rely on. At least we are giving this some individuals a decent level of care because based on affection, and that's how report in child abuse happens in our world, and that kind of things and change happens only exclusively in government's world. In their world, only way to seek help is to firstly make friends and make connection. Firstly, we want to point out that just having Jeong doesn't directly mean that you're going to lose every one of your friends. And secondly, it's really unfeasible, as we characterize from very get-go of PM speech about how these vulnerable people actually doesn't even have these commonalities to share people and to make friends in their narrative, when you only need commonalities to actually reach out to others. And secondly, we tell you why this notion itself is really harmful, that you only have to spend time and resources to people you can only connect to, because now we actually make people to actually neglect the differences and actually have no incentive to people to relate to you. The strongest case that they are giving is that this burden of microaggression. Here in your world, if you want to have a whole bunch of friends to rely on, you'll actually have to cater to your friends' needs and listen to public trend and look TikToks on viral and whatnot. And I think that microaggression of them following the public trend to actually make a lot of friends happen in both worlds. The weighing here is that it gets much harsher in their world. Why is it impossible to opt out? Because in their world, it's the sole way you can actually get connection, or maybe actually get at least the decent level of help from others, is by making friends and actually making connections. And therefore, it's even harder for their world to actually getting opt out of this kind of finding commonality stuff. And I don't think that this microaggression point actually goes to the opposition case at the end. And we talked about the minorities. Even if the minority point about leading to legislation doesn't actually stand in government's world, at least we have a more decent level of help given to minorities. The question coming from the opposition side today is that, oh, what if I don't have enough things to share? But I think that the weighing here is that in the opposition side, it's symmetric that these vulnerable people would be poor and actually don't have anything to share. But the problem from the opposition side here is that they can't even receive help from others because they're not going to relate to you being poor and actually give a penny to you. And also in Clara's POI, they said that, oh, negotiate your boss for the work condition. I think that this is in the first place really abusive thing to say to the minority to actually change and negotiate with your boss. And the benefit of the government side is that even if you have less to actually share to other people, at least you're going to be paid back for your 1 penny that is shared to others. And we think that this is a change and this is a change that we're actually moving for, because love is generally more appreciated in our society. Even if you have less to actually share to other people, just because you actually have the incentive to care for others, these individuals would have at least have a minimum level of help or donation from others under true altruism, which would never never can be expected in opposition's world. I think here that it is quite obvious that in their world, the only people who have a lot of like power and resources to reach out to people, plenty of time to make a lot of friends and go clubbing or something, will only have the people to actually share interest with others, would be prioritized in their world, never can reach to the benefits of minorities, more than proud to propose.
Thank you so much for the wonderful debate. Thank you everyone.